for the light a chalice this morning. And the chalice flame. Well, it went up. Imagine that it is burning brightly, because the flame that we have with us today is a flame of knowledge, a flame of activism. It encourages us to learn more and more about our wonderful planet Earth and be active in making life on this planet sustainable and good for all. So be it. All right, I'm going to suggest that during this time, you please do mute yourselves if you're not a speaker, and you might want to turn off your cameras as well while listening to speakers, because that might help with connectivity. In the early 1990s, the United Nations began developing an agenda to face off with climate change as it was developing. And since the beginnings of the development of that agenda, there have been annual meetings called COPs, Conference of Parties who are interested in climate change, COP. COP 27 was held in November in Egypt. And as I said earlier, three Unitarian Universalist women were there at that COP. I believe we don't have our first speaker with us yet. Carmen is not here.
I do not see Carmen. Yes, not yet. If you'd like me to, I can quickly send her a message as well to see.
Well, why don't you send her a message as well? Make sure she has the right link, although I think I sent it right to her this morning. Carmen, let me just tell you, Carmen would be calling in from La Paz, Bolivia. She has been very active at the United Nations for more than 15 years, since she was quite young, since she was a young adult. And she has attended a number of COPs. She is active on the intersection of gender and climate change, and she has attended several of the COP meetings in recent years, and she attended this one as well. When she is with us, she will be able to give us some perspective on on how they have changed. This one had 30,000 people present, and like the elephant being identified by a group of blind people, and I speak with experience, I have limited vision, a group of blind people, and the COP can be very different for different people who attend. Carmen has one experience of it. Deb and Cindy, our other two speakers, have very different experiences of it. Since Carmen isn't here yet, we'll go to
Carmen has
Debra.
just joined us. Carmen has joined us.
All right. Perfect timing. I thought things would work out well. All right. Then, Carmen, are you up and running and ready to go? We have 15 minutes to listen to your sort of overview and your experience of this most recent COP. And I've already defined what the COP is and how it has gone on year by year, but we want to hear from you and your own experience. So Carmen, go ahead.
It may be that her connection is not too good. Carmen, we can't see you, we can't hear you. Can you write maybe in the chat box if you're experiencing technical difficulties? Thank you.
That's probably the reason she was late. All right, I'm going to say that we will go on to Debra. Debra's experience was very different from what Carmen will report, but as I say, a gathering of 30,000 people from many different backgrounds is going to be different for everyone. So Debra, you speak to us first, and then we'll go to Carmen after. I hope she gets settled online better.
It looks like she just came on. Did you see her? I saw her face.
Her face did come on. Carmen, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, all right. Let's go to Carmen then. Thank you. We need to be flexible amongst women here. Thank you all. Okay, Carmen, so why don't you start us off with your overview and experience for about 15 minutes here, please.
Yeah, sorry. Well, as I was explaining the other day, today is a special festivity here in my country, where the God of fortune will give you whatever you want. So I had to go get like my dollars and my things, so God of fortune will not forget me and will give me whatever I want this year. So it's, for us, it's very important because it's an Andean God that has been, the tradition keeps on going until now. So that's why I was a little bit late, but sorry. Right now, I want to speak a little bit about my experience during the COPs, the climate change COPs. I've been engaged with the climate change COPs since I've been following since 2007, so it's been a while already. And I was able to attend in person in 2013 for the COP that was in Warsaw, in Poland. And ever since, I've been trying to be able to participate. So what are the COPs? The COPs are called the Conference of the Parties, which are these big meetings. There is a convention on climate change that was established in 1992 in the meeting of Rio in 1992. So 3 conventions at the time, 3 big problems were identified for the environment, which were climate change, biodiversity loss, and soil degradation. That's why today these 3 big problems have 3 big conventions. So now we're going to talk about climate change, which is the biggest convention, but the other ones also have their COPs and their processes that are trying to help deal with these problems. So many of you will ask me, what is the importance of these COPs? What do they do? And actually the importance, it's a convention under UN. Right now, the Climate Change Framework Convention has 194 signatories of the convention. That's a very big number of countries. Almost all the countries in the planet are in this convention. And the agreements that these conventions achieve are going to be translated at local level as policies, as national policies or local policies. So that's the big importance around what happens in these COPs. So in 2015, all these 196 countries, they gathered, well, it was a process of many years before, but they agree to come out with what we know, we now know as the Paris Agreement, which the Paris Agreement is the commitment of all the countries in the planet to reduce the CO2 emissions in order to not raise the temperature of the planet above 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. So in order to achieve that, every country has contribute to national determined actions that are done at local level in order to reduce the emissions so the world won't keep on heating. So that's basically what the convention does. So and every year they have meetings with these 196 countries in order to come with stronger policies and stronger frameworks, actually stronger frameworks that will allow countries to create policies around these issues. But there's also something that's very important to point out, is that there is a common but differentiated responsibility. I mean, we're all, climate change is our fault of all of us, but we have to fix it according to our responsibility and according to what we are able to do. So that's our common but differentiated responsibilities, because it's not the same if you live in a developed country in the north that it is if you live in a developing country like mine, for example, that historically doesn't have a big carbon footprint like many countries in Europe or in North America have. So that's one of the bases of the convention. So in last convention was in last COP was in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, in the Red Sea. That's the Sinai Peninsula. It's a place where Moses received the 10 commitments. It's where great part of the Exodus supposedly happened there. And it's very sacred in many ways because of all this tradition and history that it has. So we all know the story of the Red Sea and how the Red Sea opened so Moses could cross. So and it's got all this energy and symbolism that comes from like the pharaohs, but now it's a very touristic site. And besides all the desert that you see inside the sea, you're going to see the coral reefs and one of a very rich place on biodiversity, but under the sea, despite all the desert that you see beneath. So it's a very magical place where this COP took place. And this COP, one of the main results of this COP was a loss and damage mechanism. A mechanism that ever since I've been involved, I remember we've been pushing for it. But before, the policies were toward adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation and mitigation are long-term policies because to adapt, you need time, you need to prove and see what works or what doesn't. And it takes a lot of time. Mitigation, it's almost the same. Well, how are we going to mitigate? Basically, most of the mitigation is done by trees and forests as carbon sinks. So also like grow forest and so on takes a lot of time. So those kind of basic policies didn't have not achieved very much in the last 20 years, although we've been pushing a lot for that. So, but what is this mechanism of loss and damage? It is a mechanism that will help address natural disasters created by climate change in a more faster way, so a more effective way. So there's already money put into this mechanism, and this is going to help cope with the problem of climate change with the eventual problems, emerging problems that we're going to have around climate change around the world. For example, you all have seen the floods in Pakistan. So this mechanism could help deal with that. But for example, for those of you who have experienced the snowstorm in Buffalo this year, since it's a first world country, then the mechanism is different. But basically, I hope I tried to make a long story short. And I'm here for questions if you want. Thank you very much.
Do you want me to just start mine? I don't know who's here. I'll just start. So Carmen has a real different vantage than I do. I'm not an activist like she has been her whole life. My background is more of a business person in sales and marketing and organizational development. The difference I do have is that when I was 59, I signed up for the Peace Corps. And I went to a very remote island in the Philippines. And I spent, after my Peace Corps service, the next 10 years of my life there. So I'm not a first worlder anymore. I'm certainly not a third worlder, but I'm somewhere in between in no man's land. But what I did have is that lived experience that most Americans never get, of living in a developing country at the level, not as a tourist, not as an expat, but as a resident of that country. I experienced climate change on a daily basis. I watched favorite reefs die from dynamite fishing, cyanide fishing, sea temperature rise, sea acidity rise. So I tried to get a recycling started there from the masses of pollution that came on the currents of just the ocean and you accumulated on this incredibly gorgeous island. Unsuccessful, one, because where I, as a Westerner, saw endangered species, oh my gosh, they're eating turtles. The masses saw dinner on the table. And it's just a real different perspective you get. And that appreciation for the global South and what it's experiencing. I returned here to the US the day before lockdown, and I joined IWC. I, by this time, am a rabid environmentalist and asked them if I could represent them at COP to try to connect with other people for our philanthropic efforts. So I studied about the issues. I went for a prep to the research and universities had a program. The faith community had a program. I studied, I interviewed people who had gone to COP before to ask them what I should be doing, what I should expect. I interviewed the head of the UN's biodiversity lab. I mean, I was ready. I studied the dynasties and the pharaohs. I was pumped and ready. Have you ever heard of that, the children's book, Lemony Snicket, A Series of Unfortunate Events? I arrived at COP, totally boosted, had my shots, had my flu shot, had my typhoid shot, and got COVID. I also was scammed on my housing, so I arrived without any place to stay and with COVID that kind of took me out for the first 5 days. I made up for it my last 3 days there. And so I'm going to tell you from my experience, where I'm coming from, a first worlder, but with third world experiences. COP is a big business. I walked into the Blue Zone and it was like I was back in sales and marketing at a trade show. A lot of glitz. There were pavilions, they call them, kind of marketing efforts by countries, by organizations like WHO, World Wildlife Federation. There are multinational banks there, development banks, all kind of telling you what they're doing. And one thing that was strange, you'd have these masses of people walking in the aisles and you'd run into a television program, people interviewing a VIP to put on their local news in their home country. So it was this really high energy, you could just feel it. And very simplified, COP, the annual COPs are a culmination of the previous year's work by thousands, hundreds of thousands of people working on climate change. Governments, NGOs, private and public businesses. So all of these have the chance to have done their work for the year. Then they meet up with their compadres and talk about where their research has gone for the last year. What's the next step? Very oversimplification, but COP is really, it's not even an onion. I don't know what it is. There's so many different layers. So you have the government negotiations. You have people sharing their research that they've done, maybe on a COP committee. And then you have people who are looking to add 3 or 4 words to an outcome, to a policy. So the energy is fragmented and palpable. When I got to go to COP, my first meeting was the US State Department briefing. And I found, there were about 50 of us in the room. I found the people really informative. It was very casual. And I was impressed with their competency. One of the people had actually written a lot of the Paris Agreement. So it gave me a different perspective. And actually after COP, they gave us, this is the State Department briefing. So you can see it was very intimate. And the woman in the middle there is who wrote a lot of the policy for the US. They're very happy not to be under the Trump administration, and they were enthusiastic. That was really nice to see. And some of the things that you don't hear a lot about, you hear the loss and damage, but the US and Ghana are chairing a forest, making sure our forests are healthy. There also was developed an international drought resilience alliance that's chaired by Spain and Senegal. So there's a lot of policies that are developed there that most of us just don't hear about. Loss and damage was the big one. My problem with that was the same as Guterres's, is that yes, it moves us towards justice, climate justice, but there's not enough money in the world to compensate the frequency and the severity of the disasters that we're going to be facing. My next thing was going to Biden's speech. I thought it was a solid speech, but it was disappointing. He highlighted the methane pledge, where I really am enthusiastic or devout about non-proliferation of fossil fuels. He avoided that. He avoided that first speech of his, loss and damage. So it was, disappointing. What I did see were negotiations between governments and the chance for smaller organizations to access, maybe in the halls, it might be very impromptu, but they could avoid the Washington bureaucracy and actually get to some decision makers, including John Kerry. I saw a willingness from the research universities. The first time I saw this idea of a caring community where we all come together, share our knowledge for the global good, which is very heartening to me, because I think we need to get away from that profit and power into how are we going to come together and surmount the obstacles that are coming with climate change. I was only there a couple days, so I did not see the NGO involvement in the negotiations. Carmen did, she's very involved in that, and I know that happened. I didn't see it. We were in Egypt, and it is a police state, and they were very good at keeping the NGOs away. You had to take a bus to get to the NGO, the green zone, as it's called. I also didn't see what I expected and was enthusiastic about, was because it was in the global south, I thought there would be a lot of people there. The UN, the daily news there said there were 600 fossil fuel representatives. I mean, they didn't have fossil fuel representative put on their forehead or anything, so I didn't see them. But you saw a lot of Westerners rather than the global south, which disappointed me. There were 600 fossil fuel guys, and that was more than 10 of the African representative countries together. So that was disappointing to me. I hung out at the pavilions for the youth, for the indigenous people, Pacific Islanders, and a lot of the Scandinavian countries. I don't know if it's their socialist behavior, but they did commit long before the loss and damage fund was endorsed. They were committing. And that, again, is disappointing to me from a US standpoint. No matter what our US climate team says there, no matter what the executives say there, they have to come back and work with the US government here. And the House, the executive branch does not have the power to just say, yes, we're going to do this. So it's a big disappointment to me because they face opposition now in the House to getting these things done. My most admired group is the scientists group. They foresee our ecological collapse, but they keep on working to avert that. They keep on working. I have the highest regard for scientists. I was on a plane with one of them 5 hours back to London, and we talked the whole flight. He had prepared 20 side events for the UN Environmental Committee, and he was just wiped out. And he left early. But he said he hopes that the indigenous peoples are the last to go and the rich people go first. I then left Sharm, went back to Cairo, and I witnessed 22 million people living in pretty obvious poverty. 2 million of them lived in the cemetery, and they call it the City of the Dead. The trash and pollution between Giza and Cairo was amazing. It was hard for me, coupled with what I saw at COP, going in with my idealistic sense and seeing what I saw at COP, and then coupled with my experiences being in huge, enormous cities like Manila, Bangkok, Nairobi, Beijing, and Delhi. And I came back with an existential crisis, much worse than COVID. I agree with the scientists about ecological collapse. And it took me a while to resurface after COP27. So now my focus is on local success, having replicable models that cities can look at that will then pressure our federal government into action. And lastly, banding together as a compassionate community so that we can face those obstacles that are sure to come. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Debra. I am so glad you're a board member of IWC and helping us in our going forward. Our third speaker is another Unitarian Universalist from California. Cindy Piester works with Veterans for Peace on the intersection between climate crisis and militarization. And she was attending her first COP. And Cindy, share with us what you saw and what you did there, please.
Well, first of all, I just really want to thank you all for inviting me. It's just great to be here. It's great to see so many people coming out for this. I didn't realize what a huge group that you had. And it's also wonderful to be able to speak here alongside Debra and Carmen and their wonderful experiences and all that they do. So yes, I do work with Veterans for Peace, as well as the Unitarian Universalists for Just Economic Community. And I do want to acknowledge their work, which is just wonderful. And we're also looking for new board members for UUJEC. So if any of you might be interested in that, let me know or let somebody at UUJEC know. So I went into COP with a very firm commitment to accomplish something. I went with, excuse me, my voice would be going out now. I went with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And so we had a feminist agenda, and which includes disarming and please forgive me. I've been fine all morning and now I'm going. And disarmament, so it has that perspective. Our group did very much so. And they are also are in agreement with me about the need to cut military budgets. So I loved Antonio Guterres's opening. He said that we were on the road to climate hell. And I think, you know, what Carmen called out about Pakistan is just indicative of the kind of things that we'll be facing in the future. They lost 1,700 lives in that one climate event, with millions of homes lost and millions of people displaced. Also, even though COP did come to the verbal agreement that we were going to try to keep the 1.5 Celsius degree goal in mind, the science tells us that we will be passing that within 10 years and possibly well before. So we really have our work cut out for us because the urgency is so absolutely vital. I'm not going to get into the climate science or any of that. I just don't think I have time here. But one thing that's really important to this conversation is that because we are so very near passing any ability for human intervention, when COP functions, every emission must be counted. So I went to COP with a clear message about counting military emissions because they are not part of the overall stats. That they aren't included in or mandatorily reported. It's only voluntary, and even when they are reported, it's very convoluted and difficult to sort them out, actually impossible. And that was put in place during the Kyoto Protocols in 1997. And as a result of US government leaning on them pretty hard, and they did it in such a way so that if countries do report those emissions, they aren't disaggregated. They're all in there mixed in with civilian emissions. So it shields them from scrutiny. And that was absolutely done on purpose. And it's been in place all of these years. So that's what my focus was going there in terms of my own message. I did get to go to the US State Department gathering where Debra was, and I was the first person they called on, and I was so grateful. I was able to run down to them this whole concern that I have about the emissions, military emissions not counting, and the fact that US military emissions are the largest institutional emissions in the entire world, and that the US Department of Defense also is the biggest user of fossil fuels in the world. So we have a certain responsibility. And so I was asking for those emissions from the United States to be included in our nationally determined contributions. And I was also asking for the UN FCC and also the IPCC to take an interest in reforming the way their protocols on that and how those emissions are reported so that they're fully reported. I mean, fully. That's another conversation I'll get to in just a minute. but also transparently recorded. So reported. So I was glad to be a part of that. And another thing that needs to be brought in here too is that the United States budget, our biggest discretionary funding, more than 50% goes to the Department of Defense. And when you add in extra monies that are not included in that budget, such as nuclear weapons, which is a responsibility that we share with the Department of Energy, and bring in costs like the Veterans Affairs and our medical care for our veterans and that kind of thing, it actually is more than $1 trillion, more like 1.2 or 1.3 trillion dollars. And as those of you in the US have seen, even whatever the high figure is that our presidents are asking for, they pad it with all of this extra money. So that money is keeping us from being able to address climate concerns and keeping us from being able to pay our fair share in terms of loss and damages or the Green Fund or anything. It's sitting there, and we're using that money to develop artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, and just name it. The wish list of the DoD is huge, and it's taking precedence over all other concerns in this country, including the welfare of our own people. So that's something that absolutely must be addressed. I went to the Ukraine pavilion. The Ukraine opened the door for the first time in COP history to hold an event that calls into account the climate effects of militarism and war. And that was huge. That was huge. I think that was doable here in the United States, because certainly we were not going to address those issues in Afghanistan or Iraq, where you know that the impacts of those wars were devastating. The military missions, a lot of people think of them just as fuel use, and that's immense in and of itself. You know, with some of these fighter jets using more fuel in 1 hour than any of us use in 7 years of driving. So it's immense. And the military missions actually include extractive industries. Think about it, manufacturing, all the steps in between, supplying the US bases, 800 of them or so around the world, the massive supply chains to get everything needed for the military to where it's needed or expected to be used, all of these years. And that's not being counted. Burn pits, all of the direct emissions into the atmosphere are also huge. And then when you think about the military emissions themselves in terms of war, the destruction on the natural environment, the infrastructure and rebuilding is immense. And an international team went into the Ukraine, and they have been tracking all of these things from the beginning, and it's massive numbers over just the first 7 months of this happening. So that really opened the door for us to take a look at what is going on with these wars and their impact on the climate. So it is so extreme that 5 to 5.5%, that's in the newest figures by scientists, of our military emissions annually are from our part of the whole 5 to 5.5% every year. And consider those are not even being calculated into the equation here. So that's significant, because when we do these things, the ultimate message of this is that we must have peace. And that's because no war is any longer winnable. All of us are losers, because those emissions are accumulating in the atmosphere and they're coming back to us all as climate change. So that is an incredible argument about why we must have peace in the Ukraine, peace everywhere. And look at what these emissions are really doing to us. We need diplomacy and negotiations. So I was happy with Al Gore's presentation in the sense that he called for stopping, I know Ellen would know this, why am I blanking on this? Subsidies for fossil fuels. And that is huge, it's massive amounts of money, and 51 countries are involved in doing that. So I was glad to hear from him. I sat at the feet of Senators Whitehouse, Ed Markey was there, Senator Cardin, and they were very happy to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and how tremendous, what a great, tremendous move this was in terms of funding climate in the US, $386 billion or thereabouts. But they also brought up, or especially Senator Whitehouse, the issue of climate impacts on the military. But there is never, ever any discussion about the military impacts on climate. And I really wanted to address that to them, but they didn't stay for Q&A, they left. But that's something that we need to consider ourselves. Because when you look at the DoD budget, I mean, this Inflation Reduction Act really infused a lot of money into our system this year, but that's a one-off. And when we look at it overall, and the last several years, the US is funding militarism at 30 times what we're funding for climate. And that's the same for militaries around the world. So I was grateful that the UK event opened the door for civil society to address these issues. There was a wonderful presentation there by Debra Pritchard, who is with Tipping Point North South. The Transnational Institute was there and spoke. There's an organization, CEOBS. There's international organizations now, especially out of the UK, that are addressing this and getting tremendous response. So some of that was covered on the media. Bloomberg covered it, The Guardian covered it, and Amy Goodman was there to actually interview people at the COP. So I wanted to just throw in this very quickly, but the media coverage here in the United States on the COP of the main stations, so that's CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News, in total for the 2 weeks, gave 4 hours of coverage. It was only 18 segments for the lesser news stations. So our population is not well educated, and part of it is that it's not being brought up. One of the other things that Al Gore brought up was the predatory lending practices of the World Bank, and that is something that really caught fire at COP, and I expect that we're going to see movement on that going forward. Mia Motley from Barbados wrote a wonderful document. I think the bridge, I don't know, Bridgetown, it was a Bridgetown resolution addressing the need that the smaller countries are having to deal with. They were not only dealing with COVID, with serious inflation, with great debt, but the impacts of climate, rising seas, drought, and in the islands nations, we know this is incredibly devastating. So she got tremendous support on that, and I expect to see it in the future. My big disappointment, well, I wasn't terribly disappointed because I already knew before I went that COPs over all these years have not been giving us what we need, which is phasing out fossil fuels. So in the last hours of COP, there was a real battle, if you will, over whether or not to include language of phasing out fossil fuels. There were some 80 nations calling for that, and it's my understanding that the United States supported that. I don't know that they were pushing hard for it, but my understanding is that we are on the right side of the fence with that, which is something I still need to check out for sure. I have seen it, but I want validation about. But Alok Sharma, who was the president of COP this year, Egyptian, stop that process. There are certain technicalities in advancing that conversation, and he refused to do so. And he said it was because there were a lot of nations in opposition. But I've heard from two very highly placed sources that there were very few, just a small handful of nations that were saying, don't use fossil fuels, don't face
All right. Cindy, can we?
Can I have 30 seconds?
30 seconds, and then we need to go to questions.
Yeah. So anyway, there was trench warfare is what the MP from New Zealand said. So anyway, we have to do that. One thing I wanted to ask all of you to support, if you would, is a resolution that I wrote for Unitarians GA last year, Code Red for Humanity, which calls for counting military emissions, and I'm going to resubmit it this year. I missed by one vote. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Sorry I went over.
Thank you, Cindy. Fascinating material from all three of you. I think we already have some questions in the chat, and we do have about 10 minutes left to entertain questions. Karen, are you there to bring us?
Yeah, I am here. Let me, there's some comments. Ellen wrote, "Oh, Carmen, thank you for mentioning the magic on the Sinai and the Red Sea. Yes, it is a magical place. I was there briefly in 1991. Amazing." And Ellen also wrote, "Loss and damage were finally acknowledged, but zero financial commitments as of yet." And Terry wrote, is it fair to say that the three focal points are governments competing for money, research looking for collaboration and knowledge transfer, and policymakers looking for advantages in changes in policy? So I guess that's a little bit of a question. What would you say to that? Any of
Yeah, what I'm looking for here is if you have to summarize,
there's all
basically in a statement,
yeah, okay.
What is the objective of COP27? Yeah.
Okay, and also Terry asked, what were India and China's representation?
It was interesting going by China's pavilion. The times I walked by, there was no one there. It was empty. It was very strange. India had a lot of traffic. They both had big pavilions.
I can add to it a little bit, Debra, shall I?
Yeah.
So I had the opportunity to speak with the delegate from China, and I was really shocked to see a delegate from China there. And we just kind of glommed onto each other. She was a really young woman, and she said that she didn't really identify that much with her own government. And she was working in the rural areas on sustainability. I think her main focus really was on the recycling. I didn't have any opportunity to engage with anybody from India, but I was very happy, and I forgot to mention this in my talk just now, but I was very happy with Biden and Kerry for putting aside whatever our warmongering or our differences have been with those governments to publicly meet on stage in a plenary with Kerry met with his equivalent in China. And they didn't really give any specifics that I saw, but just that they were opening the door to those negotiations. And since they're both the world's largest emitters between the two of them, I thought that was very important. And I'm so grateful for that question.
Just my experience in India, and I come more from a background like Debra's in business, but the time I spent in India at MBA schools, the question you're going to hear from India is you're going to say, look, you Westerners, you had your industrial revolution. Why can't we? And I think that's something that, while we're being a little bit US specific, this is something we're going to have to come up with a really, really good answer for.
I think the loss and damage is part of that, answering for it.
Good.
But we're way beyond that. We're way beyond that. It's survival for the human race now. And I think that's where people are going to have to get over it and come together. And Americans especially are going to have to give up a lot of their amenities to, I mean, you just, living on this island, there was no heated water. I had cold showers. There was no clean water to drink. Even with the filtered water, you got parasites. There was no sewage system. I mean, Americans have no idea how most of the world lives.
And Debra, I think that in my experience too with Americans, over the last, since I studied environmental science in the 70s, is until we are directly confronted with the problem, it doesn't matter how many of us go running around talking about survival. Survival is not an argument that Americans hear, as long as they're doing okay today. Okay, we don't have that long-term, long-distance orientation. And if you want to go in, if I want to go in and tell my Indian MBA students, that this is now about surviving, when they're just now getting a taste of thriving.
I know.
Okay.
Yeah, they're big pictures. We each have our own niche that we're looking at, but the big picture is surviving. And you're right. And it goes, the poor people are consumed with barely surviving. So environmental and climate change is not on their radar. Those of us in the wealthy nations are consumed with keeping our amenities, our profits, accumulating our bank accounts. So, gosh, I just don't know. I'm glad I'm not a politician.
Okay, Karen, do we have any more questions in the chat?
Okay, well, Ellen said a comment, actually Biden could and must declare a climate emergency and institute proper policies circumventing the stuck Congress. And then Terry wrote, what were the next steps for COP28? And what is an example of the best practices?
Carmen, take that one, Carmen?
Yeah, Carmen.
You have experience in that.
Well, first, as I was mentioning, there is this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Problem is that when we talk about development, we have to acknowledge that there has been very dramatic processes of colonization in the last 500 years. Let's not go beyond that. That have kind of like shaped the world that we live in today. And many countries have not overcome this colonialism. They're still like depending on the business that come from outside. It's really hard to empower countries enough to come up with the development they need, because they need to be self-sufficient. And what we have seen is that we cannot be self-sufficient anymore. We live in a world highly connected. The pandemic has taught us that from the virus, like emerging from China to infecting the whole planet, was less than 3 months. That is how fast not only a virus can, but also ideas, also new thinking and things like that. And like when I started doing climate change like 10 years ago, the discourse said that you can only develop if you emit greenhouse gases. But the reality of the last years have shown us that there are countries that have been able to increase their GDP without having to increase their emissions. So there is a new way of thinking. There are new paradigms along what development means, what development needs, and that we cannot keep on thinking about a north-south country. We have to start creating these solidarity networks and try to build better countries that can face all these challenges, not only climate change challenges, we have economic challenges, health challenges, and so on. And everything goes hand to hand. And it is a process. One COP is not going to change much, as not only one conference or one agreement. We have seen that this paradigm shift is being given by private sector, is being given by civil society, is being given by people on foot, is being given by local authorities that are engaging with the problem and are trying to find solutions. So I think COPs are important because they're going to shape the framework to have policies in every country. But the real action must come from the people on foot, let's say, and also from making our governments accountable out of all the promises they're making in UN and in the different meetings and contexts. So it's not only the work of our authorities or leaders, which are, we know who our leaders are they're not the best ones in history. And in the other hand, we have civil society and some sectors of private private business that are making a change. For example, also like solar and aeolic energy were so expensive like 10 years ago, and the costs have been reducing, and we are on that shift. Also, like one of the aftermath of the war that's going on between Ukraine and Russia is that it's accelerating the shift that we need to stop depending on fossil fuels and going into greener energies. And I do feel that there is much more global awareness about the problem of climate change that we have like 5 years ago. And there's a lot more commitment of people to do things. And I think those are the takeouts where we have to work and in order to find solutions. There isn't one solution fits all, not for climate change and not for most of the problems that we face as countries and such. But we need to start with what we have. That would be it for now. Thank you.
Could I jump in on that real quick?
Real quick. We are over an hour, but real quick, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I've been meeting with a group of international activists working on the climate emissions. And one of them is International Peace Bureau out of Geneva. And we're talking about what we need to do for COP28. And one of the things that's being called for is to ask nations to put their concerns for national security to the back and start thinking in terms of planetary security and common security. We have to look beyond our own boundaries. We have to be much more generous. We have to be much more engaged. We can't just fix climate here in the US, even it's a big country with a lot of weight. We have to help the rest of the world because they don't have the means to do this. And they're dying already in large numbers. Thank you.
Thank you all. Karen, any last thing that needs to be said from the chat?
Well, there's a lot of interesting commentary. So for any of you who have visual issues and are not able to read the chat right now, let us know and we can forward you a copy of the chat so that you can read it at your leisure, maybe blow it up so it's bigger and you can see it. Yeah, because there's definitely a lot of interesting commentary and food for thought there. And I wouldn't want you to miss out. There's also a link to the, what was that? The UU Action of Immediate Witness, Code Red for Humanity, which people might want to save that. So, so yeah, that's, I guess, all I have left to say.
Thank you all for coming. IWC has a committee or a task force on UN advocacy. We meet monthly. We meet every the first Friday of most months. You're invited. Please tell Jofi if you would like an invitation to the next meeting at the beginning of February. Our UN advocacy group will be very active during the Commission on the Status of Women in March, and we are putting together 2 parallel events. Also, some people are coming to New York to actually go to meetings at the United Nations. So if you want to be involved in that, let us know. It's a good committee. Discussions like this sometimes happen at that committee as well. So if you want more of this, it's possible to find it. Thank you all for being together. Thanks to the 3 speakers for all the insights and efforts you bring. And we look forward to more conversation from all of you in the future. So be well. The chalice is extinguished, and we will remain together in our thoughts and hopes for the future. So